And that was the phone ringing, so I hope we'll be able to edit that out. But as I thought about this whole project, this oral history project of the Fians and my personal history, I thought maybe the right title for this is "It's Been a Wonderful Life," borrowing from the very famous film by that name, because it definitely has been a wonderful life and something that I have many great recollections of. Um, but as I had left off with the death of Boxey, it reminded me of the year 1968. And 1968 was a very tragic year in a lot of ways. It was a difficult year for me, and it was a year that was difficult for the country as a whole. In the spring of 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and that caused a great deal of rioting and discontent throughout the country. And then shortly thereafter, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and I think those events took place in April and May, and then in June we learned of Boxey's death in Germany. So I was feeling pretty despondent at that time. I was not happy with the way things were. Twyla had been struggling with bipolar syndrome. David at this point wasn't quite a year old, but he was the real joy of my life, and he was keeping me, I think, feeling better about things. But at the same time, there was a huge dilemma. I had exhausted my deferments from the draft, which meant that I was subject to being drafted at any time, and I could no longer use school as an opportunity to stay out of the service, and I had pretty well made up my mind that I was not going to go into military service and go to Vietnam and kill people that I had no reason to dislike. So I was considering my options, and my options at the time seemed to be, if I ruled out military service, they were going to Canada, or filing for conscientious objector status, which as a Catholic it was almost impossible to get, or just simply resisting the draft and going to jail. And none of those were good options. The last option would have been, if Twyla was healthy, we could have gotten married, and I could have gotten a deferment for being a parent of a young child. But there was very strong advice by Twyla's doctors and by our parents to not get married at the time, because there was she was in just really bad shape. So with those as options, I had in 1967, I think, before Twyla got pregnant, I had applied to Peace Corps and VISTA. And in the summer of 1968, after Boxey's funeral was over, I called my mom and I said, I'm really in a pretty depressed mood. How about if we meet downtown for lunch? She agreed to meet me, and I said, I'll take you to lunch at the Nankin restaurant, which was one of her favorite restaurants in downtown. So we met downtown, we had lunch, and I remember that my fortune cookie that day said something about going on a long trip. And I thought, if that's true, I'm maybe going to end up either going to Canada or getting drafted. And that didn't cheer me up very much. And then when I got back to my apartment on Southeast 4th Street, I had the opportunity to read my horoscope in the paper, and I'm not a big believer in astrology, but the horoscope for Pisces that day also mentioned going on a trip and packing my bags. And so a little bit later that afternoon, I got a phone call from my mother, and she said, there's a telegram at the house for you. And I said, well, I'm not expecting any telegrams, but what does the telegram say? And she said, just a minute, I'll open it. And she opened it up, and it said, congratulations, you've been accepted into VISTA. Report to Baltimore, and gave the date in which I was supposed to be showing up for training in Baltimore. Well, that was like a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. I was so happy to hear that. It was an opportunity to do something that I really believed I should be doing in terms of service to the country, much better than going in military service. And it was also an opportunity to extend my deferment, because I would be deferred for a year or two and not have to face military service. So I made arrangements, quit my job, and decided to sell the car that I had, the beautiful little Corvair Monza that I was so fond of. I left it with my mom and dad to sell because I was having no luck getting anybody that wanted to buy it. Corvairs at the time had developed a bad reputation, undeserved, thanks to Ralph Nader. And so I packed up and ended my lease at my apartment and prepared to head for Baltimore. Now, this was the first time, actually, that I'd been out of the 5-state area that I know of. I'd been to Wisconsin before. I'd been to the Dakotas when I was in school at Aberdeen. And I think I'd been to Iowa. But going to Baltimore was a new adventure and something I was really looking forward to, because in my application for VISTA, I had put down either East Coast or West Coast, and I got my wish. So I was sent tickets and information, a packet of information, which I still have along with the telegram from VISTA, and shipped out to Baltimore to a training center on West Pratt Street in an inner city neighborhood in Baltimore. The training center was an old Catholic school. It was run by the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and it in itself was a real adventure. I remember coming in with my bags and sitting them down, and the first thing they did was to ask us to do a one-on-one interview with one of the trainers, and we sat down in a interview room. And the trainer said, I've just got 2 questions to ask you. Tell me, what was the best experience you ever had in your life, and what was the worst experience? And those answers were recorded. They had a video, black and white video, and they recorded our answers. And that evening, all of us sat around in a circle in a big meeting room, sitting on pillows and watching each other disclose our most personal recollections to the rest of the group. It was a great way to get to know everybody, and it was also, I think, an embarrassing opportunity, because some of the people revealed some things that I remember one of the girls talked about having an abortion, and others talked about other very personal things. But the VISTA training in Baltimore was a great experience. It was run by some people who I think had real experience in doing this kind of training, and we were being trained to be community organizers. It was clear that they didn't want us to simply be social workers. They wanted us to be community organizers, so they kind of drilled that into us. One of the things they told us while we were there is that while they had a lease on this Catholic school, and the convent, which is where the girls slept, the boys slept in the gym. They told us that the real managers of the space were a gang of teenagers from the neighborhood who really had the run of the place. They came through. They played volleyball with us at night, but we were warned to keep our wallets and our personal things put away in a place where the kids wouldn't steal them from us. Turned out that I had a cross pen that my brother Pat had given me, and it was engraved, and I was very fond of that gift. And I left it out one night, and it disappeared. And the kid who was the leader of the gang, his name was Butcher, was about a 13-year-old whose father was an alcoholic and who had lived apparently just with his father in a very bad situation. But Butcher came through whenever he wanted to, and he was a pretty smart-ass little kid. And so one day I left my pen out on the table next to my bed in the dormitory, and my pen disappeared. So that evening I said to Butcher, Butcher, my pen has been stolen, I want it back. And he told me where I could go. And so I waited until he turned his back, and then I kicked him pretty hard in the butt. And he cussed me out and told me what he wanted to do to me and everything. And I told him that we were going to not be friends until I got my pen back. Well, it turned out the next day, after we had gone to a meeting with the trainers, that when I went back up to where my bed was and where the table was, my pen had been returned. And Butcher saw to it, obviously, that my pen did get returned, and I was pretty happy. And after that, Butcher and I became kind of best of friends. And when it finally came time for us to be sent off to our assignments, I was assigned to McKeesport, Pennsylvania. We had to catch a bus out to the airport, and I had my bags packed, and I was walking across Pratt Street, and Butcher came running from behind a building and caught me in the middle of the street, threw his arms around my legs and started begging me not to go, and he was just sobbing. And I got him out of the street and over to the bus, and I said, look, I'm going to try to get a transfer to Echo House, which was a settlement house nearby, and see if I can't do my year of service here in Baltimore. And I promised Butcher I would be back, and I did, in fact. A couple weeks later, I grabbed a Greyhound bus, and I took the bus back to Baltimore from McKeesport. And I still remember Butcher running on top of the partitions in the gym where our dormitory was, and running and screaming when he saw me coming into the building. I was not able to get transferred to Baltimore, but what I did find out when I came back was that Wally Moon, who was the director of the training center, had worked out a deal where he eventually became a foster parent and then adopted Butcher, and I think it all turned out very well. So that was kind of my first real experience as a VISTA volunteer. I also had a kind of a momentary adventure with one of the girls that worked in the kitchen that catered the center. Her name was Lorraine Day, and she and I stayed in touch for a while after I had gone to McKeesport, but she never did come up to visit me. But what did happen is after I had gotten moved to McKeesport, I was assigned to share a room with Eric Yaffe, as a kid from Fall River, Massachusetts, and we were given a room in a house that belonged to Mrs. Bessie Davis, an elderly black woman who lived on Walnut Street, 1242 Walnut Street. And this was, I think, a great experience, particularly for Eric, because he had never really spent any time around black people before, and he certainly wasn't familiar with soul food, which Mrs. Davis prepared for us every morning and every evening. She didn't make lunch, but she did give us breakfast and dinner. And Eric learned to, I won't say he appreciated, but he learned to eat things like black-eyed peas and oxtail soup. And he had molasses on his pancakes in the morning. It was quite a cultural shock for Eric, a Jewish kid who had gone to Brown University. So our first couple weeks in McKeesport were quite an adventure. We were transported from the airport by Alex Powell and Bobby Bennett and J.B. Rouse and Johnny Smith, all who worked for the OEO program, which was our host.